Today, the House released its budget proposal. It's a proposal divorced from reality that seeks to balance the budget on the backs of those in the country who can least afford it. It takes from the middle class and gives to the ultra-wealthy. Without a doubt, my colleagues and I will have much more to say about the Republican budget in the coming weeks and months, but today I want to discuss a section of the budget that seeks to deny the very real and very current threat of climate change to our public health and military readiness. The Department of Defense is responsible for protecting the security of the United States, and that requires taking into consideration every threat multiplier that affects the global security environment and our national interests, including climate change. That's why the military spends considerable time assessing the effects that climate change could have on its facilities, capabilities, and missions, and how those effects could undermine its ability to protect our national security. It's really unfortunate that today in their budget proposal, House Republicans said this planning is wasteful spending. Look, I'm as against wasteful spending as anyone, but preparing for threats to our national security planning and operations is the opposite of wasteful. It is prudent. Today, I want to talk about how a climate change prohibition would tie the hands of our national defense strategy. Climate change affects our national security in two major ways. First, the DoD has warned that climate change is likely to impact the military's facilities and capabilities. In particular, America's military bases may be particularly vulnerable to climate change. According to the 2008 National Intelligence Council finding, more than 30 U.S. military installations were already facing elevated levels of risk from rising sea levels. In my home state of Hawaii, for example, Navy and Marine Corps installations like Pearl Harbor and Marine Corps Base Kaneohe Bay are literally on the water's edge. According to the Department of Defense, the combination of decreasing sea ice, rising sea levels, and thawing permafrost along the coast of Alaska has increased coastal erosion at several Air Force radar early warning and communications installations. This coastal erosion has already damaged roads, seawalls, and runways at our bases. Second, climate change exacerbates the drivers of global instability, including drought, food shortages, water scarcity, and pandemic disease. Admiral Sam Locklear, the third commander of U.S. PACOM, said that the biggest long-term security threat in the region is climate change because, quote, "it is probably the most likely thing that is going to happen that will cripple the security environment." And I just want to make a point here. The Department of Defense is in no position to get caught up in our partisan or ideological battles. The Department of Defense has to deal with what is. The Department of Defense has to prepare for and contend with reality. And we should have debates on the Senate floor. We should talk about whether the President's Clean Power Plan is the right approach. We should talk about how we should approach international agreements coming into the Paris Accords. Let's have that debate about whether or not a carbon fee is the most prudent approach. But what we should not do is make it impossible for the Department of Defense to do its planning and preparation. And that's what the House budget does. In its 2014 QDR, the Department of Defense warned that the effects of climate change are threat multipliers that will aggravate stressors abroad, such as poverty, environmental degradation, political instability, and social tensions, conditions that can enable terrorist activity and other forms of violence. The stresses could break the backs of weak governments and institutions in countries around the world where the United States has enduring interests. In particular, the National Intelligence Council stated in its Global Trends 2030 report that climate change will pose stiff challenges to governance in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's why I find it ironic that many of my Republican colleagues who are so committed to slowing the pace of our withdrawal from Afghanistan on the premise that doing so will preserve our security gains and keep Afghanistan stable are now tying the hands of the national security community so that they are unable to study the security effects of climate change on Afghanistan and the region. And again, I don't think we should tell them how to study it, what conclusions to draw, what preparations to make, except to say that we should stay out of their way, as they do their security planning, as they do their security preparation. I am not suggesting that they take my view on climate change. I am suggesting that they are allowed to deal with what is, and that they are not sucked into a partisan ideological battle over climate change. They don't have the luxury. They don't have the luxury of getting sucked into a partisan ideological battle when it comes to climate change. They have to deal with what is because they are responsible for our national defense. Fortunately, while some in Congress play politics, our military leaders are clear-eyed about the current and present threats posed by climate change, and they're making the necessary investments in the knowledge of impacts to their readiness and to regional and global conflicts. We need to back them up and make sure that climate deniers do not tie one hand behind their back while they work to understand the threats to defend our country.